Hey, I think it's time. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this afternoon's seminar here at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. I'm very happy to see that we have a turnout despite the rather miserable February weather outside. And a heartily welcome also to our online audience. This seminar is streamed online via NUPI's YouTube channel. And if you, after the seminar, wants to go back to some of the details that have been discussed here, you can find a recording of the seminar at our YouTube channel. My name is Helge Blakkesrud. I'm a senior researcher here at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs and an associate professor at the University of Oslo. And it's my pleasure to chair this seminar this afternoon. A seminar on Putinism and regime ideology in post-Soviet Russia, a very topical issue. This seminar is part of a seminar series related to a project called Values-Based Legitimation in Authoritarian States, or for short, Legitrus, since the focus of the project is the Russian Federation. Over the last couple of years, we have invited the participants and partners in this project to come here to Oslo to present their ongoing research. And today we are so lucky as to have Associate Professor Mikhail Suslov from the University of Copenhagen visiting us. In the project, Mikhail is covering the Russian Orthodox Church and its attempts to justify Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So he has contributed a book chapter based on this topic, and this will be part of an edited volume called Political Legitimacy and Conservative Values in Putin's Russia. That is due to come out on Edinburgh University Press later this year. But today, when we invited Mikhail to come here, we asked him to widen the scope and to focus not on the work he has done for the projects per se, but what he has done related to his latest book, Putinism, Post-Soviet Russian Regime Ideology, that came out earlier this year, so fresh from the press. Mikhail will talk for some 40 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A session, and we will wrap up around, or shortly before 4 o'clock, I assume. But without further ado, it's my great pleasure to give the floor to Mikhail. Please.
Thank you, Helge. Thank you all for having me here. That's my great pleasure, and I am very happy to present the main argument of my book for the Norwegian audience. So I will start by making some methodological remarks in order to make you understand where I am and how I do my own research and how I did the research on this book. I need to make a caveat that I am not a political scientist. I'm a historian by training, with a special focus on Russian intellectual history. So what I basically did for this book is I used or applied my research apparatus on research in contemporary Russia in the period of roughly the last 20 years or so, since more or less Putin's assuming the second presidential term. In this research, I'm using the definition of ideology, and I'm here inspired by works of Michael Frieden and other specialists in morphological studies of ideology, and I define it as a system of arguments which people use in political debates. and each element of this definition is meaningful. So if we start with the concept of system, so it is a system with internal structure, meaning that inside it you have a complex and intricate relationship among various concepts, and some concepts are in the center of ideologies, or an ideology or ideologies, and others are on the periphery, and some concepts could be contingent or interchangeable. In my book, I'm considering a vast variety of different concepts, including Eurasianism, Russian world, Holy Russia, Russian civilization, and many others. But today I'm not going to focus on them because these are more or less contingent concepts which could be replaced by other concepts, and actually it happened. So when I'm talking there, I mean Putinist political elite, they were making sense of the concept of Russian world first, and now it is more the Russian civilization which is coming to the fore. So in my talk today, I would like to focus not on these peripheral concepts, but on the very core, on the heart of ideology. I will try to make you understand what Putinism is about. Second component of this definition is that it is a system of arguments, yeah? Which, and here I sort of mildly disagree with those specialists who say that there is a difference between classic ideologies and contemporary ideologies. And contemporary ideologies, they include not only ideational components, ideas, concepts, and so on, but also political feelings, metaphors, visions, and so on and so forth. I think that we don't need to inflate the concept of ideology. Ideology is still about arguments, how people argue about something politically meaningful. So to give just one example, imagine a patriotic political singer, shaman, for example, and he is singing, I'm proud of being Russian, and he is not arguing why. So he is making his statement convincing by other means, by artistic means, right? He is not arguing why he is proud of that. And for an ideologist, it is instrumentally necessary to argue why I adhere to this or that statement. And finally, arguments are being used in political debates. They are not just hanging in the air. They are always used, and they are used to disprove somebody else's position. So if you understand what is the main target of Putinist ideology, then you understand half of its message. And I can make it clear right now, Putinism is emphatically against liberal democracy. So this is its main enemy, and the whole argumentation is constructed around this motivation to disprove liberal democracy. In my book and in my talk today, I'll be using the concept of regime ideology instead of official ideology, because so far, and I highlight this so far, Russia doesn't have an official ideology. It has the so-called mainstream ideology, which is a shared system of arguments of those who have access to the central media. This is my working definition of Putinist elite and regime ideology. And in the book, I cover views of more or less 300 various intellectuals, experts, political figures, those who make their ideological statements and who argue about that, yeah? Who make some complex, meaningful, argumented political statement, not just express what they think. So for the book and for my talk today, there are 4 major questions to be asked and to be responded. Is there regime ideology in Russia at all? What is the attitude of the elite itself to ideology? What is the ideological identity of Putinism? where does it stand in the family of other ideologies, conservatism, fascism, nationalism, and so on. And finally, what is the message of Putinism, or what do they want to say when they lay out their arguments? Okay. So the question whether there is a regime ideology in Russia is fairly clear for me. It is a definite yes. And here I ground my argumentation on several moments. So first and foremost, despite some researchers who argue that risk management is a typical instrument for any authoritarian regime, I think that the recent events, and I'm thinking specifically about the war in Ukraine, I'm thinking about the ban on registration of Nadezhdin, I'm thinking about the death of Navalny. I think that all these events make it clear that the regime and its members are confident about what they're doing. They're confident, they're ready to take risks beyond just the risk management. And I think that their readiness to take risks comes from something, namely from their ideological conviction. I think that it makes them think that they stand on the right side of history. It gives them the sense of righteousness. It gives them the argument to believe that they are on the right path. Secondly, since the beginning of war in 2022, we don't actually observe any significant dissidents inside the Russian political elite. You can really, literally count the number of dissidents on one hand, which gives me an idea that perhaps there is actually a shared system of political values among those members of the political elite. Then we need to factor in the presence, or rather crystallization, of a pretty powerful ideological education apparatus. I'm going to say a few more words about that later on. Right now I just want to point at the established course, university course, the fundamentals of Russian statehood. And it is reported that more than 80% of all Russian students were included. They passed through this course since September last year, and in the years to come, their number should be close to 100. And this course requires the whole infrastructure. It requires the infrastructure of producing qualified teachers, textbooks, university facilities, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think that it goes beyond just propaganda. It's not about propaganda, because the university course on the fundamentals of the Russian statehood, it is exactly that. My understanding of ideology, it's a systematic description of ideological premises. It's the argumentative thing. It gives the students the instruments to argue that liberal democracy is a bad thing. And finally, let's take into account the whole raft of very explicit statements of the major political figures. And here I'm thinking about Bastrykin, the head of the Russian investigative committee, Chuichenko, he is the minister of justice, I guess it is called in Russian, in English. They are major political figures of the rank of ministers, and they, in the past year, especially in autumn last year, they made quite significant statements about the need to actually abandon the present acting constitution and adopt a new one because of the presence of Article 13. Here you can see the quote from Alexander Bastrykin from November last year, and he says, Article 13 actually forbade to have a state ideology. But is it possible that a state and society live without an ideology? No, it is impossible. and these guys are definitely very well versed in Russian legal system, in laws. They are actually creators of the legislative system of Russia, and they perfectly well know that they can't change Article 13 without changing the constitution itself. So the whole point of amendments in 2020 was that these amendments were included in all different other chapters, not in the chapter 1, 2, and 9. So I'm thinking specifically about chapter 3 and the article 67.1, to which all these ideological additions were included. So yeah, the bottom line of this slide is that, yes, I think that we can meaningfully speak about the presence of regime ideology in today's Russia. So what is the elite's own attitude to ideology? Here we'll make a short historical foray, but it will be connected with the present, I promise. So Putinism is not Russia's first regime ideology. This is Russia's third regime ideology. The first Russian regime ideology was the notorious triad elaborated in 1830s by Count Sergei Uvarov, who served for almost 30 years as the Minister of Education under Nicholas I. Importantly, Sergei Uvarov never thought about his own triad. Triad, this is orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Православие, самодержавие, народность. He never thought about that as an ideology. He kept on saying that it is how things actually are. So he himself always was very careful about his status as a scholar, Orientalist, and he understood his ideological work as the work of a scholar who actually discovered something in the Russian people and just made it explicit. This is this triad. In order to understand his way of thinking, you can think together with the metaphor of a gardener, which actually some of his pupils used. So a gardener should base his or her work on scientific knowledge. You basically need to know which kind of plants you are cultivating. You need to know whether you are growing up a palm tree or an apple tree. And if you are mistaken, then it won't lead to anything good. If you think that your apple tree is a palm tree, then probably you'll make only harm to your plant. So you have to understand what you are actually growing. Yeah, growing, and you think that he served for 30 years as the Minister of Education. Of course, he kept in mind people, the people whom he was growing. But you have to also know the conditions or internal properties of your plant or your people. Yeah. Simultaneously, it is still a gardener, meaning that you have to protect your orchard, your trees from cold winds, from invasion of insects, and so on and so forth. So you still have to be active. And this is exactly how he understood the role of triad or ideology. It is understanding of what actually is and protection of what actually is from the external threats. Marxist-Leninism was emphatically scientific, as you know. If you take only Lenin, he spent his years writing academic books on Russian economy, for example. But Marxism is also teleological, with a clear vision of the utopian endpoint in history. When we come to contemporary Russian regime ideology, then it displays, especially its recent development, a quite interesting connection with Uvarov. Recently, in autumn last year, they erected a statue of Uvarov in front of the St. Petersburg University. And some prominent intellectuals or members of the Russian political elite, like Vladimir Medinsky, he made a quite elaborated lecture on the meaning and role of Uvarov in Russian intellectual history with the view of putting him squarely into the pantheon of predecessors of Putinism. In the 1990s, the attitude to ideology was understandably quite critical. And you can think in this context about Putin's statement in 2007 that there is a Russian favorite entertainment inventing a national idea. He was saying that in his address to the Russian parliament with a smirk. Or you can think about Alexander Lebed's statement that the best ideology possible is 100 sorts of tea in the grocery store. So this was an emphatically anti-ideological position on the grounds that ideology is a violent, artificial imposition on freely living nation. However, in the roughly the same period, 1990s, beginning of 2000s, you have the so-called red-brown opposition, which is a sort of shorthand term for this conglomerate of radical nationalists and revanchist communists. And they made a very explicit concept of ideology grounding on three experiences. The first experience is certainly Marxist understanding, rather post-Marxist understanding of ideology. You can think about Gramscian understanding of ideology as something ubiquitous, as something inescapable, which is entrenched in our everyday life, in our culture, in our mental schemes. So the point for them is not to have or not to have an ideology, but which ideology you have. Either you yourself work out your own ideology or somebody else gives you this ideology. The second experience is the Cold War experience, when ideology was used as the instrument in geopolitical battle. And finally, this is the nationalistic experience of thinking about Russia as a besieged fortress surrounded by powerful enemies. So when you connect all these dots, you will get a very precise picture of ideology which they had in their minds. Ideology is a geopolitical weapon which allows Russia to maintain its sovereignty, an instrument against foreign intellectual invasions, because otherwise ideology has the power of making you act against your own interests, and this is something which they wanted to prevent. The interesting point is that this initially marginal understanding of ideology located on the fringes of political spectrum moved gradually to the center of the political mainstream. So this is actually how the Putinists understand ideology today. And here I can quote from Tatiana Gurova. Today she is the editor-in-chief of Expert. So a ban on ideology is the same as a ban on having an army after capitulation of a state. So this is exactly the same as they spoke in the 90s. I mean people like Prokhanov, Dugin, and others. Or even more recent statement by Alexander Shipkov, director of Russian Orthodox University: ideology always exists. A country would not last a single day without it. What does it mean to write an ideology? It means that you have to study and describe the actually present ideology. And he grabs something quite important for Putinists today. This is the idea that ideology should come up in a scientific way. Here I can refer to the group which is called Russia's DNA, presided by Andrei Polosin. Andrei Polosin, up to now, he was pretty obscure spin doctor with a degree in neurolinguistic programming, actually. And he's reported to be close to Kirienko. And and suddenly he made a skyrocketing career. He became the he became the deputy head of RANEPA, this presidential university. So with all probability, he has a specific task, the task of working out the ideology for the youth. So he is the one who stands behind this university course, Fundamentals of the Russian Statehood. But what I would like to draw your attention to is that he, together with his superior, Kharichev, who comes from presidential administration, and some other people, he penned an article, an academic article. I definitely wouldn't memorize its title. It's called Perception of Basic Values, Factors and Structures of Socio-Historical Development of Russia. And it is published in an academic journal. It has a DOY. It's an academic article. And in this article, these people work out what they call pentabases. So Uvarov spoke about triad, and they speak about pentabases. 5 elements, 5 major themes, components of the Russian statehood. Yeah, so what are these 5 elements? So these are patriotism, which is connected with the, so they did sort of scientifically structured Russia in 5 layers. This is the country, state, society, family, and an individual. And for each layer, for each level, you have a specific value. Patriotism for the country, trust to society, solidarity to trust to the state, solidarity to society, tradition to family, and creativity to people, to individuals. So yeah, you can clearly see that the same thrust to represent your ideological pursuit as an academic, scientific way of understanding of what actually is. Not what should be, but what actually is. It actually is, but it also needs the state protection. So we are back to this Uvarov's gardener metaphor. So having decided on how the political elite thinks about ideology itself, I would like to address one of the most controversial questions in the book, which is the question of ideology's taxonomic identity, ideological identity. So in the literature, typically you have several attempts to classify Putinism as either fascism or nationalism or conservatism. And actually, when I started my book, it was the project of writing a paper about conservatism. And then when I was working on this article on conservatism, I understood that it is not conservatism. So I needed to write the whole book in order to prove that it is something else. So what is this something else? Let's try to figure this out. So the fascism and fascist affiliation with Putinism is probably the most debatable issue, the most controversial one. And sometimes audience reacts quite sort of aggressively when I say that, no, Putinism is not fascism. But it does not mean that I sort of try to vindicate Putinism or say that it is, a good ideology. I think that Putinism simply does not tick all necessary boxes of a authentic fascist movement. So if I ground my understanding of fascism on Griffin's famous definition as a palingenetic ultranationalism, then it has at least 3 components: a radical social transformation, a radical return to the past, and a national regeneration. And actually you have none of the 3 components in Putinism. So it definitely is not about social transformation, and definitely is not about the return to the past. It has a special relation to the Second World War, but it is not an idealization of Stalinist past. Nobody and never says that we should bring Russia back to 1941. That is kind of meaningless. What they say is that Russia's victory in the Second World War is sort of messianic event, just like resurrection of Christ. You can't, if you are Christians, you can't think about crucifying Christ for the second time. But you still think that crucifixion of Christ is a very meaningful event. It structures your time because it kind of starts the process of fulfillment of God's designs about the world. So they definitely think that sometime in the future there would be another Second World War, but they don't want it. So just like Christians, they know that the second coming of Christ would happen, but they don't want to make it happen as soon as possible. And also I need to say that for Putinists, the present regime is the best possible regime, actually. They idealize the present, not the past. Their model of the past is the incremental growth of Russian statehood. So they say basically that Soviet Union was better than Imperial Russia, and post-Soviet Russia is better than Soviet Union, so you are growing up and up. It's not that you are living in the state of crisis, as the majority of fascist intellectuals would say. When we are thinking about nationalism, I think that Putinism is not fitting into this box either. Because nationalism clearly requires two particular basic fundamental ideas. The idea that there is such a thing as homogeneous national community, and the world is divided into these homogeneous national communities. And that there should be a congruence between this national community and the state. Putinists think in completely different terms. They think in terms of civilizations. And civilizations would include several nations. And they could be congruent with a state or with several states, actually. So there is neither of these two parameters fit into the Putinist worldview. And finally, conservatism. So this is what sort of ignited my research. The basic idea of conservatism is the concept of organic change, that only organic change without violent impositions could be accepted, without artificial planning, artificial blueprinting. And this is exactly what Putinists want to do. They want to plan and blueprint. They want to program the future. Think about Putinists' major ideologists like Kirienko and others, and they were trained in the circle of methodologists. And the gist of their idea is that you can program the future. And here comes the catch. They don't know what this future is going to be. So this is sort of planning without the end goal. In the book, I call it the ideology of don't rock the boatism. As you probably remember, back in around the time when there were massive protests in 2011-12, many Russian state leaders said, don't rock the boat, don't rock the boat. So I think that this ideology could be boiled down to a pretty simple code of operation, the sort of Czechism without the Marxist end goal, without the Marxist utopia. In order to understand how they think, you can consider the metaphor of a boat on a lake. Unlike sailing down the river, when you sail on the lake, you yourself define the final destination. And the only important thing when you sail on the lake is not to capsize your boat. So Putinism is this operational code on how to keep your boat afloat. So it definitely is not about the organic change and the preference for status quo. When we are talking about status quo, then the Russian history, the structure of Russian history does not allow them to use the potential of conservatism in full because of all these upheavals, revolutions. So when it comes to status quo, so which status quo are you going to defend? Is this post-Soviet, Soviet, pre-Soviet, or what? So I think that Putinism does not fit into all these boxes, and that is why we need something else. And we still lack the language to describe this something else, because I think that Putinism it just started this new wave of new generation ideologists. And we are just in the process of working out adequate terminology to grasp and understand that. Tentatively, I argue that the whole Putinism is revolving around the concept of cognitive sovereignty. And I'll try to make this point with the help of this next slide. So I think that there are three ways to describe this cognitive sovereignty. Yeah? So the first is that it is a right-wing communitarianism, and it discusses the dynamics of individual and community relationship. So to put it simply, the communitarian side in Putinism argues that there is no place for universal values in the world, that you have multiple civilizations, the idea which was entertained by Putin since at least 2007. It's a pretty entrenched way of thinking. So each civilization has its own way of thinking. So there is no place for this famous Declaration of Independence statement that all people are made by God to value three things, which are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. No way, no way. Putinists think that it is only good for Americans, and what is good for Russians is something else, and what is good for Chinese is also something else. So here is the quote from Putin, and he's quoting one of his favorite philosophers, Ivan Ilyin. If I consider Russia as my motherland, then it means that I love and think in the Russian way. Well, banal statement, but if you think twice, it is the very crux of Putinist thinking. If you are a genuine liberal, nothing could be more weird for you than this statement, that you can think or love in Russian way, in Danish way, in Ukrainian way. That's kind of totally out of place. We all think and love in human way, but for him this is the place. The second way to describe this cognitive sovereignty is that this is an identitarian conservatism. When I'm talking about identitarian conservatism, I'm spotlighting how Putinism understands the community with the stable, unchangeable core of values. So, for example, the World Russian People's Assembly in 2011 came up with the whole list of those values, which are unchangeable. So different intellectuals elaborate their own different sets of values. You remember this pentabases with their own set of values. But the World Russian People's Assembly believed that the Russian values are characterized by faith, justice, peace, freedom, unity, and a dozen of other values. And geopolitical populism. And here I would like to grasp how Putinism understands horizontal characteristics of the community. To help me make this point, I would like to quote from Vladislav Surkov from 2019. So he is writing, thanks to its gigantic mass, the deep people. So here is the most important notion which he is using, deep people. The deep people creates an unsurmountable force of cultural gravitation. The ability to hear and to understand the deep people and to act accordingly is the greatest advantage of Putinist's regime, Putinist state. Yeah, and this statement I think is quite consequential indeed. If you remember another time, the Speaker of Russian Parliament, Boris Gryzlov, said that Parliament is not the place for discussion. And he became the laughingstock for many liberals and oppositional figures. But actually he expressed what he actually thinks. This is the very essence of this populist worldview. You don't need to discuss things because you already know them. Yeah, here they are. So here they are. If you need to discuss whether you can accept same-sex marriages, for example, you don't need to vote because it's already there. So the values, the set of values is already inside the deep people, and it has always been there for 1,000 years since the baptism of Rus in 998. However, it's not just a populism. We need to qualify it. It's also a geopolitical populism, meaning that unlike normal, typical populism, Putinist intellectuals argue that Russia is representing the global majority, the grassroots, the world grassroots, who are striving against the golden billion, the global elite. So they sort of extrapolate the domestic dynamics between the elite and the grassroots on the planetary level, arguing that there is the global majority and golden billion, and Russia stands on the side of global majority. And if I have maybe a couple of more minutes, I think, yeah, so this is actually my last slide. So, having said some words about the place of Putinism in this intellectual landscape, I need to say what is the message, what is the point of populism, or what is the point of Putinism. In the book, I came to the conclusion that the main point of Putinism is that it is an intellectual, ideological work with the imitative westernization. And here I rely on the studies done by researchers like Sakva and Krastev, and they say that the greatest problem of democratic transition, not only in Russia but elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe, is imitativeness of its westernization. So we can specifically think about countries with especially long, proud and imperial history. Not only Russia, but also Poland or Hungary, for example. For them, imitative westernization is adding insult on injury. It's simply insulting for their national pride, because imitative westernization means that the best thing which you can possibly achieve has already been achieved by someone else, by Western Europe, a long time ago. So when you say to the Russians, well, the best version of Russia is when you will be looking like Denmark 50 years ago, that's totally unacceptable. This is sort of out of place. This is completely unacceptable for so vast majority of Russians. And how they process this imitative westernization, what they suggest instead of that. So first, this is the spurious or quasi-anti-colonialism in Putinism. Why it is quasi? Well, because Putinism is colonial itself, obviously. But also I think that they do not actually propose any real alternative. Anyways, so this is the criticism of the West, and here is another quite meaningful quote from Putin, and Putin is quoting Alexander Zinoviev. You know probably Alexander Zinoviev, especially people with some experience in Russian and Soviet studies. He was a Soviet dissident who was pressed out of the country and lived in Germany, and in Germany he became anti-Western, and he came back to Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union and joined the ranks of those Red Browns whom I already mentioned. So here's the quote: "In order to survive, the West needs the whole planet as its habitat, and it needs resources of the whole humankind." So this is deeply unfair that only one civilization among several others, the West, it requires the resources of the whole planet. The second argumentative step to work with imitative westernization is the concept of a more just world order. And the more just world order is the idea based on multiple civilizations concept. So they believe, and they express it in writing, that Russia's global mission is the defense of justice, which sounds quite ironically in today's context, but I think that it is quite deeply entrenched in people's mind. Important to know that justice, and they elaborate on the concept of justice quite eagerly, justice is understood as the combination of two things. First, it is truthfulness, and second, it is social fairness. So when they say that the West is unjust, what they mean is that the West is lying to the people. It is distorting the picture of reality, arguing that you have life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And Putinism says, no, we have multiple civilizations with multiple sets of values. And because of that, because of cognitive incorrectness, the West is also created the socially unfair world order when you have uneven development and ecological crisis. And yeah, actually Putinism is quite happy to free ride on ecological agenda, arguing that the West has created the ecological crisis for the whole planet. And so I'm pretty much sure that it resonates with many other peoples outside of Russia. And finally, geopolitical liberalism. And in order to understand what I mean, I would like to quote from Dmitry Peskov, not the one whom you know, but another Dmitry Peskov, the special representative of the president in on digital and technological development. And he penned an article, quite amazing one, which is called Russia the Island in 2022. And there he argued, technological sovereignty means that we shall build an island on which we are the bosses. We are adults, we make decisions, and we take responsibility for them. So this sounds like complete, like verbatim repetition of John Stuart Mill classic postulates of liberalism. But these postulates of liberalism are extended on the civilizations. That freedom of civilizations, believe that civilizations are adult and responsible persona. This is in the very center of their thinking. Okay, so I will stop with just making two questions. So the first question, which I just tentatively try to respond in the book, is how important is Putinism for the domestic audiences? How does it resonate with the popular values, with the popular opinions? And second is how Putinism is potentially meaningful in the international context. Could there be some important connections between Putinism and, for example, Bolivarianism, Maoism, Guevarism, and other left-wing anti-globalist isms? So yeah, I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikhail. Yes, if you grab a chair. And then thank you very much for this very wide-ranging presentation and for ending on two questions. And maybe you can give some answers to those questions during the Q&A. We'll open up the floor now for questions and comments. And it's also possible for you back home following this online to pose questions. So feel free to write in, and then we will take your questions here. And since we have an online audience, we would also need to use a microphone. So wait for Maria to approach you. And yes, we'll start here. And please introduce yourself, Daniela.
Thank you, Helge. My name is Daniela Slabinsky. I'm a PhD student at the University of Oslo in Russian area studies. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, Mikhail. I have a question regarding the deep people. I've noticed among the Russian oppositional journalists and media that they too operate with this term, глубокий народ. And they argue that they need to speak to the deep people to be able to somehow counter Putinism. So, do you agree that the deep people is an empirical fact that we can ascertain? And is it key to actually counteract Putinism? Is it a good strategy, do you think?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. Well, I definitely don't think that the deep people could be an analytical category, but it is a very important ideological category with a long history, actually. When you think about Slavophiles in the 19th century, or Narodniki, the populists of the second half of the 19th century, they all believed exactly in that there is some real people out there, and this real people actually possesses some fixed set of values. And if you look deeper into the political philosophy of Slavophiles, then they believed exactly in that. To people belongs the opinion, to the Tsar belongs the decision. So I think this was one of the first manifestations of populism. The bottom line of this thinking is that it is the Tsar's obligation to understand those deep people and these deep people and their values, and to act accordingly. So yeah, this idea is quite intellectually venerable with a huge pedigree. So Surkov was not the first one who spoke about the deep people. Coming closer to, or trying to answer the second part of your question, whether approaching the deep people could be a good strategy to counter Putinism. Well, it's a huge discussion, and I try to give some tentative answers to that in my book, but I'm not a sociologist. I think it takes a sociologist to actually decide. I think that we have to differentiate between political meanings and political values, and political meanings could be contingent. So today you support the military operation, tomorrow you forget about that. But values are something more stable, which persist over generations. And the conclusions to which I came in the book is that Putinism is actually, it does not come from the thin air. It is deeply entrenched exactly in the deep people, in their perceptions, in their rejection of imitative westernization, in their perception that Russia is unique, perception that the West is unfair, and so on and so forth. I think that sociological surveys which show around 80% of support of the war in Ukraine, or Putin's actions, or Russia's policy in general, they grasp actually quite accurately the size of support of Putinism. But, here comes the but, I think that Putinism, and this was my sort of punchline of the book, Putinism is not the fate of the Russian people, because there could be a different combination, different ideological combination. And I suggest one in the book. This is social democracy of Scandinavian type, actually. I think that social democracy could have found even greater resonance in Russia had they had a real social democratic party, but they don't have it. Yeah.
Follow up. So you say there is an acceptance for Putinism, sort of an immediate acceptance of the tenets of Putinism in the deep people. But would there be a need, you think, to formalize Putinism, or could it continue to coexist so that you have the Article 13 that bans a state ideology, but you could still have a formalized, institutionalized regime ideology that could be, could that coexist without any further formalization? I guess that's what I am asking.
Well, yeah, this is something hypothetical, we don't know, but judging from the tendency, I think that everything is coming to formalization of ideology. So yeah, we have this infrastructure, we have this university course, we have the group of people who are on the payroll to write, to sit down and write ideologies, yeah? A sort of physically ideological job. So I think that it's not going to evaporate anytime soon, and yeah, sooner or later, and yeah, very likely that even the constitution is going to be changed. Actually, today Putin is making his statement, right? I don't know, I didn't have the chance to read or listen to it, but I think it could be quite consequential.
Okay, next question.
Matthew Blackburn, NUPI, and thank you for a fascinating talk. Just to follow up on the question of state ideology and the constitution being changed, I think you obviously don't have time to cover the whole debate, but there was an important response from Valery Zorkin, the head of the Constitutional Court, in which he made it clear that there's no need to name the ideology and officially codify it because the set of values are clear, and those values are codified in the Constitution. So there is no benefit to naming it. And the flexibility, he even said that it's better to have flexibility, then we can shift policy. So therefore, I would say that Bastrikin is in the minority, and he has a kind of militarized view of a Cold War mentality, which represents the hawk kind of faction. It's not a faction, apologies, it's not a faction. Hawks, just call them hawks, different individual hawks in Russian politics. But my comment was about, my question was more about a clarification on a comment you made on Putinism is primarily a reaction to liberal democracy. And I know you said you're not a political scientist, but liberal democracy is a regime type. There's about 15 to 20% of the world are liberal democracies. And I just thought whether you might clarify that in terms of, or maybe it's more profitable to see that in terms of liberal internationalism as a universalist ideology. The only universalist ideology that exists in the world today that is promoted by the West and that has a teleological vision of transforming humanity and achieving a vision of modernity that involves the democracy, human rights, the market. We're all familiar with it. But that is what Putinism is, a reaction to a universalist ideology. And I just wondered if you would agree that it is in fact, that is the best way to understand it, if it's a correction of your statement, or maybe you have a different view.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for these corrections. I tend to accept them. I think that we can probably speak about some different things, or about the same thing, but using the different research apparatus. I was primarily and am primarily interested in political philosophy of that. So when I'm saying liberal democracy, I mean the political philosophical position actually. Namely, the position that individual is rational first, adult and responsible person. And this rational, adult and responsible person can step out from his or her background, which is radically opposite to communitarian position. So when I want to grasp the actual difference, the actual cleavage in the political debates, in which Putinism is locked, then Putinism stands on the communitarian position against the liberal position. So just to reiterate, so the communitarian position espoused by Putinism says that you cannot step outside from your background. If you were born a Russian, you cannot just say that I don't want to be a Russian. If you say so, then you do not stop being Russian, you remain a Russian, but you are a bad Russian, you are a traitor. Whereas the liberal position is that you always decide. This is your rational decision. And when you make another step forward towards the political processes, then the liberal democratic political philosophy claims that this is the contractual agreement of the community on having this or that. Whereas the communitarian position is magnificently expressed by Edmund Burke in his famous reflections on the revolution in France, where he says that a community is the community among the dead and the future and the present generations. So basically the same idea of deep people and the stable core of values, which is so popular among populists today. Yeah, so this is my standpoint.
I have a list here now. It's Paul, then it's Bendik, then it's Håvard, and then it's you. So we'll start with Paul.
My name is Paul Kosse, in charge of the research project which...
Is this on? Is the microphone on?
Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent talk is emanating from. I started doing Russian studies some 30 years ago, and we called it Soviet studies at that time. But I came from a background of history of ideas. So I wanted to make use of that background in Soviet studies, and I wrote my first article on war and peace in Soviet ideology. I don't think any of my colleagues liked that or found it interesting, because they were trained as political scientists and came from a realist background, and they wanted to know only one thing or two things. Why are the Soviets acting the way they do, and even more importantly, what will they do next? So can ideology, the question was, does it prescribe and prescribe any actions? And if it does not, then it's just, in their view, embellishment or ex post fact rationalization. So, and then we don't have to pay attention to it. So, and when you say that the ideology is cognitive sovereignty, I mean, if I should have an uncharitable reading of that, it means that what we do is right because we are doing it, because we are sovereign in our thinking and action. So, and a final comment on communitarianism. I'm not sure if I would say that this is communitarianism, because the community thinking in the communitarianism is the local community and not the nation. Nation is too big to be a sort of a communitarian community. So, and I don't see very much focus on the local community in Putinism.
Yeah, thank you. So again, I tend to agree with your comments and corrections regarding communitarianism. I made the qualification that this is right-wing or conservative communitarianism, and yeah, for the lack of a better term, I dub it conservative communitarianism, but yeah, it's not the classic one which is being propagated by people like Michael Sandel or Charles Taylor. And speaking about the prescriptive role of ideology, ideology definitely does not set up a strict way of actions. It gives the menu of opportunities. It sort of tells you what could not happen, but it does not tell you what can happen. And on top of that, my sort of personal remark of why this is important and interesting for me. I think that any political thinking is precious because people rarely think politically. So I think even Putinism in this sense is precious. It's like the flowers of evil. This is something which is potentially destructive, something with which many of us would like to fight and dedicate our lives to fighting that. But on top of that, this is the human creativity, the precious kind of human creativity, political thinking. And on these premises, it should be respected.
Okay, next one is Bendik.
Hi, Bendik Manum here with Nupi. I'm not going to try to correct anything, but I did think that I would ask, but I think it might be an annoying question that you might have gone tired of. I remember a year ago there was a lot of talk, particularly in the media, about Putin's brain, Dugin. How does he fit into all of this?
Yeah, my general response to this is that that Dugin is definitely not in the very center of political mainstream. His role is exaggerated in the literature, and he contributed meaningfully to creation of several concepts like Eurasianism, but also the Russian world. But well, today's presence of Dugin in the statements of the political leaders and members of the political elite is almost invisible. So that's my sort of conclusion. If we were speaking about the period of, for example, first half of 2000s, then my response would have been different. But today, she's no longer the most important intellectual.
So who would you put there among the sort of the inner circle of thinkers?
Yeah, my understanding is that today the closest ideological collaborators of Putinism and Putin, they are coalesced around the Valdai Club. I mean specifically Sergei Karaganov. I think that his role has been underestimated, and actually he is tremendously important. I don't know the exact channels of his influence, but when I compare what he writes in his articles and then what Putin says, then there is almost literal parallels between these two. So yeah, Karaganov is definitely number one, but you can also count in people like Lukyanov, Fyodor Lukyanov, Timofey Bordachev, all these people who stand for the international relations, for the elaboration of the concept of Greater Eurasia, turn to the east, turn to Siberia, and so on and so forth. With some reservations, you can also name several religious figures, including Patriarch Kirill, for example, but with really some reservations. Again, we should not exaggerate their importance.
Okay, we have a question from the online audience, so we'll take that in before we go to you, Håvard.
Actually, I have two, so we'll take both. From UC Lassila, what is the actual difference between regime ideology and non-ideological authoritarian crisis management? Could it be so that Putin is convinced that ideology is needed to manage crisis?
Thank you. Should we take Jussi's question first and then...
Yes, so I took this point in the very beginning, you remember. I spoke that perhaps Putinism goes beyond the crisis management. And the reason why I say so is simply the different scale of crisis which is being generated by Putin's regime compared with the regime of Serbia, for example. Yeah. So, and when you also include into your big picture the explicit statements, ideological statements of the members of the Russian elite, then I think that it becomes pretty clear that they are motivated at least partially by ideology too. So it is more than just crisis management.
And the other one is from Ingrid Oppdal. On the international potential, you mentioned the unjust West argument. The potential is right there, but there are also limits for Putinism related to Russian foreign policy. What are your thoughts on this?
Limitations to Putinism's prominence in international relations, right?
Yeah, there are also limits for Putinism related to Russian foreign policy.
Yeah. Well, speaking about the ideological domain, where I can say it more or less professionally, I think that it is limited by the ideological prominence of the second most important pole of power, China. I don't think that China is ready to forfeit its own quite explicit and long time cherished ideology and adopt Putinism just in a heartbeat. So yeah, I think that the major partner of Russia, Russia's strategic partner, China, despite all these declarative statements on the side of Kremlin, is not ready to accept Putinism as its lodestar. However, when it comes to some other countries, especially I'm talking about Africa and Latin America, and the summits, Russia-African summits, and all this infrastructure around their collaboration, tells me the story that something is being done also on the ideological level here. And they try to enlist the support of people in those parts of the world by ideological means, by all this raft of ideas about unfairness of the world order and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Okay, let's return to the audience here, but if there are more questions out there, please send them. But next one is Håvard.
Håvard Bekken, Institute for Defense Studies. So it's actually Lassila's question, except he was more effective than I will be, and I think you were perhaps also too effective answering it. So it's pertaining to whether this ideological production comes from a position of strength or rather a position of weakness as you know, the Red Browns who laid the foundations, had to put out for this ideology. They came from a distinct position of weakness in terms of how they envisioned Russia to be in a state of crisis and a need of rejuvenation based on patriotic education or patriotism from the Soviet era. And I think this sense of vulnerability is still very strong within the ideological discourse as I read it. That we need to change the history textbooks because if we don't change it, we will eventually fall into despair. That Russia always increases its degree of indoctrination due to the lesser doses is not able to cure the patient, so it's sense of desperation there. So you say that Russia is not in a state of crisis in ideological terms, but celebrating the contemporary. So I was wondering, how did this change from the 90s until today? How did this happen? In what terms? And secondly, what is the relation between ideological production and regime stability, as Lassila hinted to? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll start responding to your question by agreeing that ideology is certainly the weapon of the weak. This is something which you adopt in order to withstand the external pressure. In this sense, Putinism and Putinist ideologists always keep on saying that they are the underdogs. They are the colonial slaves fighting against the colonial masters in the West. In this sense, their ideology is certainly couched in terms of anti-colonialism. If you scale down the argument to the domestic politics, then I think that this statement does not hold water, because Putinism is getting more and more confident in step with the elaboration of its own ideology. So these are two sort of opposite tendencies here, but I don't see that there any major contradiction. So yeah, Putinism feels confident also partially because of its ideological production. If I answer to your question or qualify it.
When did this happen? How did it happen? Of course, it's a gradual response, but I mean, the idea was originally to love Russia in bad weather, as I said, whereas now suddenly they are more glorifying the contemporary. If I understand you correctly, though I think they're not
glorifying the contemporary. Yeah, well, in this sense, yes. Well, Putinist vision of history is the optimistic vision of history, arguing that the present is the best possible world. In this sense, you can say that Putinism is sort of self-glorification, but, well, any ideology is self-glorifying. So I honestly don't catch the contradiction here.
Well, the contradiction
Microphone.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, go ahead.
I mean that a lot of ideas about Russianhood is based on imperfection. Like, we are the people who drive recklessly without seatbelts, right? And on the national level, this is also present in patriotic and ideological discourse, in the sense that we are victimized and we are under constant threat. So the youth, for instance, there's a big problem. They are embracing Western values. This was the same thing in the 1970s. It's seen as a threat against Russian identity, and therefore it needs to be countered. So it's an argument from a position of weakness or position of being threatened. This is not a sign of everything being perfect now. On the contrary, it's a sign of Russia being in big trouble, which needs to be countered through increased indoctrination, etc.
Yeah, I think, I grasp your point, and yes, I can agree that Putinism is internally contradictory on several levels, and this is one of them. So you can also name another contradiction between its universalism and particularism. Its universalism is self-contradictory in the sense that they argue that we fight against all universalism. So this emphatic anti-universalism is universalist as well. And I think that this contradiction which you spotted is just yet another contradiction inside the system.
Okay, then the next question is here.
Thank you. Duco Dijkma, I'm currently interning at the Dutch embassy here in Oslo. And to add to the list of contradictions, I think you mentioned it just now a bit. Putinism seems to really focus on the authority of Russia and of the Russian civilization, and that every civilization might have its rights to its own ideas, so against universalism, like you just mentioned. But then again, it also, as you said, might want to represent those people that feel oppressed by Western universalism globally. That feels like a contradiction. So to put it in economic terms, do you think Putinism is for the internal market only, so for Russia, or might it also be exported to other countries, you know, some regimes in Eastern Europe or elsewhere?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, this is what keeps me busy right now. I'm starting a new project exactly on that, on how resonant is Putinism outside of Russia. And my sort of starting point of analysis is that it certainly has a potential, but then we need to go down to the ground. And it has a potential because of its possibility to connect both radical right and radical left spectra, sides of the political arena. So it can both please the right-wing populists and leftist regimes outside of Russia. And another reason why Putinism can potentially have international resonance is a particular kind of messianism which Putinism is today espousing. And I'm touching upon this topic in the book. I call this phenomenon low-cost messianism, which is a new sort of messianism. Russia is a messianic country, has been so for many centuries, but today we have a new twist of this messianism. Unlike this explicit messianic thrust of the Soviet period or pre-Soviet Orthodox messianism, today's Russian messianism makes a statement that Russia is fulfilling the global mission by simply being Russia. So full stop. This is what people like Kolmogorov, but also people in power, Karaganov, they're literally quoting from Kolmogorov, arguing that Russia's mission is destroying the global hegemonies. Elsewhere I quote from the priest who turned to be the actor Akhlobystin, Ivan Akhlobystin, and in the interview to, I think it was one of the Orthodox thinkers, he said that Russia's mission is when another hegemon comes up, we smash him into the face. Когда очередной глобалист появляется, мы его по мордасам. We smash him into the face. So this is this sense of low-cost messianism, that Russia is simply destroying attempts to transform the world into a uniform world dominated by one center. So they point at Russia's fight against the Mongol, against the Golden Horde, for whatever reason. Then you have Napoleon and Hitler, and now Russia is doing exactly this. It is smashing another globalist in its face, which is the United States, and Russia is doing that in Ukraine. So this is the point. Yeah.
And you can read more about this in Mikhail's forthcoming chapter in the book that I mentioned previously. But now it's Jakob.
Thank you, Jakub Godzimirski from this institute. I would like to have a small comment on Karaganov and his role in the current context, and then also follow up a little bit with this discussion about to what extent Putinism can be kind of exported to other countries, to other societies. Concerning Karaganov, we had Karaganov here at the Institute 15 years ago, where we celebrated 50th anniversary of the Institute, and my impression of him was that this man is, that his ego is bigger than he himself is, and I think that the main driving force for Karaganov is to be seen, and I think also that what Karaganov does, he somehow reads what Putin wants to hear, and he states and writes those things that he thinks that Putin wants to read. So I think that the flow of ideas is kind of a little bit different. It's not ideas coming from Karaganov, but Karaganov being able to somehow feel the steam or feel the mood and then translate this mood into some statements. Concerning the ability of Putinism to be exported, I think that there is also one of those big contradictions, because on the one hand Putin argues that the most important negative impact on the Russian history was exerted by communism. That was also a kind of universalist ideology that could have an appeal in different types of societies, because this was a universal ideology promising a kind of new, better world, while Putinism is something of a kind of on Russian origin and should not be exportable. But there is this, there are those two elements of Putinism: the revisionism that is definitely appealing to those who feel that they deserve a better place in the system, and then building this revisionism is also very much driven by the idea of containing the American hegemony. So this is the combination of revisionism and anti-Americanism that makes some of the Putin ideas being acceptable in other societies as well.
Yeah, thank you. I would briefly comment on the first part of your question. I tend to disagree with your interpretation of how who influences whom. I think that it's more complex. I think that this is kind of two ways move of ideas, because Putin is not an intellectual himself. He is not an ideologist. He is not like Lenin, who sits at his table and produces his 25 plus volumes of writings. So the actual dynamic is that people around Putin are, as you said, are trying to guess his wishes, are trying to guess his mind, and they come up with different texts, and then Putin cherry picks on them. So I think that, yeah, they try to guess, but then the initiative comes anyways from them, because I doubt that he is capable of producing a coherent ideological text. And on the international pertinence of Putinism, I just want to make a small remark also connecting to the question about the limitations of Putinists' prominence internationally. Well, and this also has to do with the internal contradictions of Putinism. This emphasis on sovereignty on the civilizational level is self-defeating, because you basically say that we are sovereign, but then you deny sovereignty of some others, like Ukraine, for example. So where this border actually comes, and why can't you accept the situation that somebody in the West would say that, well, but Russia is not an independent civilization, it's just part of the West. So why should it has a sovereignty at all? Yeah.
I was wondering if you could say something more about fundamentals of Russian statehood. So we've had this new initiative now with first all school children having to go through the conversations about important things, and now the new subject that all students would have to take. Can you say something more about content, the scope? What is it? What do you learn? What are the fundamentals of Russian statehood, and how I guess it's impossible to say how effective it is, but could you say just something about the content and what kind of vision of Russia that students now have to internalize?
Yeah. So first and foremost, there is, as I mentioned, a huge infrastructure behind that. You have several intellectual think tanks, DNA of Russia, working on that, plus a circle of intellectuals in RANEPA, in Russian Presidential University. And then you have Znanie Society. You probably, those who research Russia for a long time, in the Soviet time you had Znanie Propagandistic Society, and they rebranded it 2 years ago with Z logo on it. I don't know the exact connections among these different institutions, but Znanie is providing the platform for DNA of Russia, for those people involved in this ideological education to give out their lectures and to spread their ideas. Also think about 3,000 teachers of these fundamentals of the statehood who got special training. So 3,000 people who came to Sochi, I guess, or to some sanatorium where they got this training, and actually this was the selection of the best of the best. So the actual size of people who are teaching this course is greater, because each university is supposed to have that. So you can imagine that this is perhaps 1 or 2 teachers for each faculty. So it could be maybe between 15, 20 teachers in one university. And if you multiply it by the number of Russian universities, including all provincial ones, then you'll get a pretty massive number. Secondly, when you come into the actual content of this course, I can judge from reading of the textbooks. I didn't do the field work on how actually it has been taught. But the content of the textbooks is as follows. So today we have 2 textbooks and 1 methodological instructions on that. 2 textbooks are prepared by different collectives of authors, but they are actually in collaboration. And actually these 2 versions are sort of close copies of each other, but one is destined for students of humanities and social sciences, and the second is targeting students from all other technical and natural sciences specialities. So one is more detailed, another is less detailed, but both have their core, the pentabasis, because Polosin is behind both editions. For one, Polosin wrote the preface. For another, Polosin wrote the chapter where he laid out his pentabasis. So yeah, this is a systematic course on ideology education.
And a huge operation. Did your 2 fingers mean that there are 2 questions or 2 minutes? 2 minutes. So a very short last question.
Sure. My name is John Eric Topolov-Ervik. I'm a bachelor student, pupil of Helge. And I was wondering, do you see Putinism as a potent mix for these populist projects, especially in Turkey and Hungary, where through such a course like the Russian statehood, making something similar, the regime could legitimize itself in a cost-efficient way through education?
Yeah, I think, and this is actually the bottom line of the whole book, is that Putinism is the greatest competitor of liberal democracy today. It's no longer communism, and it is no longer religious fundamentalism. I think this is Putinism, which actually assumed this role of the knight fighting against liberal democracy everywhere. In this sense, I think that Putinism is internationally consequential and it tries to present itself as the flag bearer of all anti-Western, anti-liberal movements across the globe.
Okay, then we have come to an end. I would like to thank Mikhail for coming here and sharing insights from his book. If you haven't bought it, it's here. I would also like to thank you in the online audience and you here for coming here today, and then stay tuned for the edited volume of the Legitrus project. So welcome back. But for now, thank you very much, Mikhail.